Day 20 concludes in the Karen Read trial, and today we are going to recap Day 20 as well as Day 19. In case you were wondering, hey, where is Brother Counsel's Day 19 analysis? Well, the answer for that is that I did not put out a special video for Day 19, and mostly the reason is that there just wasn't that much exciting information that came out in Day 19. This is really more of what I call the boring part of trial. You're dealing with forensic experts. They're just going through a lot of the pieces of evidence that they collected and sent through their lab and looked at and how they labeled them. And it's important to get this all into evidence. You need it in evidence, but it's just not that exciting. So that's why it just wasn't such an exciting day, and there really wasn't that much to take out from the trial. But nevertheless, actually, from Day 19, there were some important pieces of information that came out. A lot of people are talking about it, and I'm noticing that some people are misunderstanding about some of the testimony that came out. So here I am. I'm going to help you understand how this evidence is coming in, understand what the experts were talking about, and hopefully answer some of the questions that people are discussing about the evidence that came out on Day 19, as well as recap Day 20. So before we jump into the actual analysis, I just want to make a few quick announcements. Number one is that I was invited to appear on Surviving the Survivor, that channel, and I joined a panel of some other wonderful people, and we had a great discussion on the Karen Read trial. If you haven't seen that yet, I'm going to leave a link in the description so you can go check out Surviving the Survivor. If you haven't subscribed to their channel, that's also a great channel. Joe Waldman is wonderful. He's a phenomenal host, and I've gone on their show a number of times already at this point to discuss different trials going on. On top of that, there was another very talented, intelligent young woman, Lauren Conlin, who was part of the panel, and she then invited me to talk to her about the Karen Read trial on her podcast. So we had a great discussion on her podcast. I'm going to leave a link in the description for her podcast. It's called The Outlier, and certainly worthwhile to follow and subscribe to her podcast. So also, one other announcement before we get into the actual analysis today, and that is that we did start memberships as an anniversary of this channel came and went. At this point, we introduced memberships. Some people were sending me messages that they love to become a member, but it's just a little bit too expensive. So the good news is I lowered the prices so that everyone can really join the membership if you want and get some extra content, and it should be hopefully fun and educational. So with those quick announcements out of the way, let's jump into the actual analysis of what happened on Day 19 and Day 20. So Day 19, we heard from Kevin O'Hara, a lieutenant in the Massachusetts State Police, and he is the team commander for CERT. CERT just stands for the Special Emergency Response Team, and they come to collect evidence. So Lieutenant Tully told him to look for taillights and sneakers, or a sneaker. So he went down to 34 Fairview. He was looking for some pieces of taillight and sneaker, and what do you know? He found some pieces of taillight, but he only found 6 or 7 pieces of taillight. And obviously, this is going to be significant because there was something like 43 at the end of all of everyone's search. There ended up being something like 43 pieces of taillight. So anytime you have a person who searched and didn't find something like 43 pieces, it's going to be an argument for the defense saying, hey, this guy came, he looked through the entire property, and all he found was 6 or 7 pieces. How in the world did those other pieces get there? Oh, must be that they were planted. So that's probably what the defense is going to argue. But nevertheless, his testimony was that he found 6 or 7 pieces there, and what do you know it? He also found a sneaker by the curb. So he found that sneaker by the curb, and he also testified on direct examination that Michael Proctor was not on the scene when he found the taillight, because at that point Trooper Michael Proctor was following Karen Read's vehicle back to the Sally Port, where eventually it was processed. All right, and then cross-examination, what came out from cross-examination was the fact that he didn't actually start his search of 34 Fairview until 5 p.m. on January 29th. Now, he first got the call about 2:30 p.m., but he didn't eventually get there till 5 p.m. Now, remember, the body, John O'Keefe's body, was discovered around 6 a.m., and the scene was unsecured since about 7:50 a.m. So you have from 7:50 a.m. until 5 p.m., which the scene was completely unsecured before Kevin O'Hara with his team came to look for evidence. So certainly enough time for anybody who wanted to mess with the scene, add things to the scene, plant things in the scene, and that's what came out. during cross-examination. Now, also, they went through that on the final mission report. There's a lot of information that was accurate. That's what the defense brought out. But look, all these pieces of information are accurate. And then all of a sudden it says that in the final mission report that an officer was hit and dragged by a vehicle at approximately 12:30 in the morning. And the argument here is obviously going to be that that wasn't really so accurate, was it? That's more of a guess or trying to pin this accident, this death on a vehicle, which obviously is associated with Karen Reed. Okay, now what's interesting also, the final thing that came out from Kevin O'Hara was the fact that he told Trooper Michael Proctor, he told him, again, this is Kevin O'Hara telling, and Kevin O'Hara is this special emergency response team. He is the leader. He's the team commander. He's this expert at collecting evidence. And all he found was 6 or 7 pieces of taillight. And it was, of course, it was a blizzard going on, and it was very difficult to search through all the, or not a blizzard going on, or there was a lot of snow there. And they were sifting through all the snow to find pieces of taillight. And obviously that's going to be the state's argument that with all that snow, it's hard to recover all of the pieces of taillight. But he did tell Trooper Michael Proctor that, look, if you want us to come back, we're happy to come back when the weather's nicer. Just give us a call. We'll be happy to come back and search for more evidence. But what happened? Actually, Trooper Michael Proctor never called him back. Even though there was a number of different searches that were performed at that property, he never decided to call back Kevin O'Hara to come and search the scene again. Again, this is the expert. If you want to do a real expert search of the property, you should probably call the experts. Nevertheless, it was brought out in cross-examination that he was never called back to the scene when the weather got nicer. All right. Then we heard from Maureen Hartnett. Maureen Hartnett is a forensic scientist with the Massachusetts State Laboratory. And she examined the SUV, and she was discussing some different damage to the vehicle that she noticed. And also, what everyone is talking about is that there was a hair that was found by the taillight. All right, there's a hair found by that taillight near the SUV. And there's also a piece of glass that was found on the bumper. Okay, and then she collected the hair. She looked at it under a microscope, and she also gathered together this piece of glass from the drinking glass. She also talked about the red Solo plastic cups, which she tested for blood, which was blood. And also she swabbed the gray sweatshirt, the orange T-shirt, the jeans, the sneakers, and she swabbed all this stuff. Okay, now what everyone's discussing about this hair, right? So this hair, everybody wants to know, what is the story with this hair? How in the world did this hair, and this is what came out in cross-examination, this is what Alan Jackson brought out, which is a great point, is that let's think about it. This hair was not embedded into the taillight, that area. And in fact, the way that she was able to remove that hair was simply by using a tweezers. That's how she was able to remove this hair. Just taking a tweezers, ploink, and taking it out. That's how she was able to remove this hair. So this wasn't stuck. This wasn't embedded into the car. How in the world did it make it? And the thing that Alan Jackson brought on in cross-examination was the fact that this car was towed 60 miles in a blizzardy conditions with high winds and snow. And somehow this hair stuck to this vehicle all the way into the Sally Port. It sounds a little ridiculous how that piece of hair can just stay there without being blown off. So that was the point, and it seems like it was planted there after it got to the Sally Port, right? And then also that piece of glass. That piece of glass, how did it just sit on the bumper? It wasn't embedded into the bumper. It was just sitting there. And again, this is in the middle of a blizzard, a tremendous blizzard, high winds, being towed 60 miles, all the bumps or whatever the tow truck is passing over in order to get to the Sally Port, and somehow this piece of glass stays there as well. So that was the points that Alan Jackson brought out in cross-examination. Now, I want to also talk about the hair because I think some people are misunderstanding this. All right, this expert did not testify about whose hair that is. So who really cares if she discovered a hair there? She's not even talking about whose hair it is. Is it John O'Keefe's hair? Is it some other random stranger's hair who, in the blizzardy conditions, somehow a hair got stuck to the taillight? So she's not even identifying whose piece of hair this is. Well, the reason for that is the following. She did not test it for DNA. Okay, you have to understand what the limitations of each witness is to testify. She can't just testify about what the results were from other people testing it. That's not her personal knowledge. So therefore, what she is allowed to testify is what she personally observed or what she personally tested. Now, she took that piece of hair and she looked at it under a microscope. And in her part of the lab, what she was allowed, or actually this is all that they test for in her part of the lab, is to see and determine whether that hair-like substance is actually a hair, or is it a thread? And if it's a hair, is it an animal hair, or is it a human hair? Is it a hair from some other substance? What is this hair? Is it a human hair or not? All she determined by looking at it under the microscope was that it was a human hair. And she's able to see the characteristics of a human hair, and she determined, and that was what her finding was, that this piece of hair was a human hair. That's it. Now, what she did with that piece of hair was she cut it in two, and she sent the part of the hair which is connected to the body, the root. They have an internal lab in the Massachusetts State Crime Laboratory where she was able to send that to get DNA testing. Now, she did not perform the DNA testing, but it was sent to the lab to perform DNA testing. So we did not hear yet from an expert about the DNA on that piece of hair. So presumably, we are going to still hear testimony from a DNA expert talking about that piece of hair. The other part of the hair, again, she cut the hair. So the bottom part, which is the root of the hair, which was connected to the body, she sent to the internal part of the lab to test for DNA. The other part of the hair she sent to an outside lab, and this is where they're going to perform mitochondria testing on that part of the hair. That's just that testing their internal lab doesn't do. So they had to send that to an outside lab. So that's what happened in terms of the hair. Okay, so let's not jump to any conclusions that, she didn't even testify about whose hair that was, because she can't. She can't testify even if somebody else tested it and they tell her what their findings were. She's not going to testify to that. So let's just calm down there. Now, in terms of the glass, right? So the glass also has to be tested. And now we heard more about glass from Ashley Valor. So Ashley Valor, just one other point that was brought up before we move on to the next witness, is that March 14th was when many of these items were submitted to the lab, which is strange. It would seem to be strange because, again, this happened January 28th, 29th, 30th. I mean, they collected all this evidence much earlier than March 14th. So why are they only sending it to the lab on March 14th? Send it right away. What's the wait? All you got to do is label it, tape it, sign it, and send it out to the lab. What's everybody sitting on their hands for all those 6 weeks? So that was a point also that came out in cross-examination. All right, now let's move on to Ashley Valliere. Ashley Valliere is also a forensic scientist, and she was also talking about the different pieces of glass and other substances which she found, some of the debris that she found, which was embedded into some of John O'Keefe's clothing, the glass that was embedded into the clothing. All right, so she was going through some of that. And again, what was brought out during, another thing that she said was part of what she was doing is to be able to determine whether other pieces of glass connect with are they mechanical fits with other pieces of glass. So that was what she was also talking about. Part of the taillight and all these pieces, are these pieces compatible as maybe being part of the same original taillight. So that was also part of what she was testifying about. Some pieces of glass fit would make sense that it was connected with other pieces, which would eventually equal to a taillight, and some not. Now, also, again, a good point, which they brought out in cross-examination, was the fact that the date of the collection of some of these pieces of taillight. So the first piece of evidence that was submitted to the lab was notated that the date for the collection was February 3rd, 2022 by an officer DeChicho, something like that. DeChico. That was the first few pieces of taillight. That was February 3rd, 2022. Now again, remember this is January 29th, January 30th, so it's pretty close with the incident, and you can make an argument that the snow had to melt, and finally the snow melted, so they went back down to the scene. They collected more evidence. They got a much better view of the lawn, and they were able to collect more pieces of broken taillight. But that's February 3rd, 2022. And there were some very small pieces that were collected in that sample by this officer, the Chicho. But then you have Trooper Michael Proctor, who's also has some evidence that he collected, which are dated later. So February 8th, 2022, February 11th, 2022, and February 18th, 2022. So all of these later dates, February 8th, February 11th, February 18th, all of a sudden, Trooper Michael Proctor is finding all these extra pieces of taillight that Officer DeCiccio, that's his name, and I'm sorry if I'm butchering it, I don't mean to, but he didn't find it. So the first officer's there after all the snow melted, and he's looking through all the lawn. He found some pieces, and some of them are very small. And if you look at some of the actual pieces of taillight from what Trooper Michael Proctor put in an evidence bag and sent to the lab after Officer DeCiccio was done looking, later dates, some of those pieces are much bigger than the pieces that the first officer found. So how did the first officer miss those pieces? He found much smaller pieces, but all of a sudden Trooper Michael Proctor finds on 3 other dates later big pieces of taillight. So that was the part of cross-examination which was, I thought, very strong against this expert. Again, the expert didn't do anything wrong. The expert was just saying about the pieces that she tested in her lab. But that part did come out in cross-examination, a very good part. Now, we had Christina Hanley. Christina Hanley also was talking about different pieces of glass and from the bumper that some matched, some didn't match. Okay, so that was what they were talking about with those forensic scientists. All right. Then we get to Sergeant Yuri Bukhenik. And Sergeant Yuri Bukhenik was the supervisor for Trooper Michael Proctor. And he goes through, and this is all direct examination, so we didn't hear anything about cross-examination yet, so don't start jumping to conclusions, but we will at least go through some of the direct examination for Sergeant Yuri Bukhenik. So he's a supervisor of Trooper Proctor. He got a call at 6:44 a.m. that morning. He called the on-call officer, who was Trooper Michael Proctor, and again, just kind of trying to show that this wasn't set up. That wasn't like Trooper Michael Proctor asked to be the trooper investigating the scene. He just happened to have been the trooper who was on call. So he contacted him, Proctor, and they then went together to the Canton Police Department. They eventually got there at 9:15. So this is the supervisor, Yuri Bukhenik. He got there at around 9:15 in the morning, and Michael Proctor was already there. Now, they met with the detectives. They met with Sergeant Good, as we spoke about in previous videos. He was one of the first responding officers. So they met there at the Canton Police Department, and then they went to the McCabe residence. We've heard about this already from the other testimony that the McCabe, Jennifer McCabe and Matt McCabe and Brian Albert were all interviewed by the McCabe residence. And that's where now we're hearing from Sergeant Yuri Bukhenik that they went to the McCabe residence afterwards to talk to Jen, Matt, and Brian Albert. And he did testify that they spoke to them separately. Each witness was secluded from each other. The witnesses that were not being talked to were upstairs, and each witness was by themselves, which is exactly how you're supposed to. And on cross-examination, I think it would be worthwhile for the defense to point out, tell me, why did you separate the witnesses? And he would say, well, of course, you have to separate the witnesses. That's how you do an investigation. So you say, oh, so you're telling me that if a Canton Police Department, or say if a police officer would not do that, that would be terrible, terrible practice, wouldn't it? And that's exactly what happened in this case, as you recall from the beginning, when the first sergeant, I think it was, Officer Lank, when he went into the 34 Fairview residence, he was talking to everybody all together. So at least I think maybe a point to be brought out on cross-examination. We'll see if they actually do that. Alan Jackson looks like he's going to be the one to conduct the cross-examination. All right. Then they went to Good Samaritan Hospital to see John O'Keefe. And they identified him. They collected some of the clothing for evidence. And he also saw John O'Keefe's body. And he spoke about the bruising over his right eye. Now, I thought that there was something interesting that happened, and that was when this Sergeant Yuri Bukhenik was on the stand. So he started talking about subdural hemorrhages. Okay? Now, I don't know if police officers talk with that type of sophistication when they're talking about injuries. I know doctors do. If you have a medical ed, maybe nurses do. But police officers generally, you wouldn't think that they talk with those terms. Okay, now this could, I'm not making too much about it because, it could be he's a very educated person and that's how he talks. And for him, it's very normal to talk about subdural hemorrhages. That's possible. But he was talking about it like he talks like this all the time. So it just struck me as a little bit interesting. Now, so he talked about subdural hemorrhages, and he was asked again, this is all direct examination by Lally, that what you observed on John O'Keefe, was that similar to observations of subdural hemorrhages that you've seen in other cases? And he testified yes. And this is really borderline whether this should be admitted through this witness. He's not a medical expert. That's clear. And you're identifying a diagnosis, let's call it a subdural hemorrhage. And you're asking him, well, does this look like other cases which you found out later were subdural hemorrhages? I mean, it's really borderline, I think, in my opinion, whether this witness can actually testify to that, because he has no medical background. He has no medical education. And to say that, yeah, that looks to me like you need to be an expert. Okay, so yeah, he's saying I'm not saying that it is. I'm just saying that it's consistent and that I've seen like this. I understand the argument. I'm just saying I could have understood how the ruling would have been in this case, that he's not allowed to talk about this specific diagnosis of subdural hemorrhage. You can say there's bruising by the eye, things that laymen discuss, but it just seemed like he was given a little bit more leeway than a lay witness should have. All right. Now, he also talked about the abrasions on the arm. And he was asked, tell us about abrasions on the arm. And he said, it appears to him. Again, this is a police officer. This isn't a medical professional. This is not a doctor. This is a police officer testifying. And he said that there was blunt force trauma, friction, to the epidermis of the skin, where a crushing of vascular system occurs. Okay, this is his definition of what an abrasion is. Okay, ask any police officer to define abrasion. I don't know if they would define it as blunt force trauma friction to the epidermis of the skin where a crushing of vascular system occurs. I just don't know whether that's how police officers talk. Okay, so again, it could be that that's how he talks, and it could be that he has the education, but it just seemed to me a little interesting. All right, now he did say that he attempted to speak to Karen Reed at the hospital, but she wasn't there. Again, so remember, she's at the hospital. He's gathering up him and Tripper Proctor are gathering up all the clothing of John O'Keefe. They looked at John O'Keefe. They saw his injuries, and they looked for Karen Reed, and Karen Reed wasn't there. Karen Reed already went home to her parents' house. So they eventually went to her parents' house to discuss with Karen Reed what happened. Now, we'll get back to that because Lally decided also to take a little detour here. So he showed the sweatshirt. That's when he got up on the stand, cut open the evidence bags, and started showing the actual sweatshirt, showing the T-shirt, showing the shoe, showing the belt, showing the jeans. And also they showed pictures of John O'Keefe's actual body. And that's something that the live stream obviously did not have, but the jury did get to see that. And there was a cautionary instruction before by the judge that, of course, this can invoke sympathy, but as you took an oath, your decision is not to be based on sympathy. So she had to give that cautionary instruction because you're going to see this police officer, John O'Keefe, or this human who looks really, really bad and beaten up. So, but they were able to show pictures of that, and they did. All right. Now, he also testified that there was no pieces of clothing that they gathered from John O'Keefe that were put together in the same bag as other pieces of glass. So this is significant because, as we know, there's been some testimony that there were some pieces of glass that were embedded in the clothing of John O'Keefe. And if they didn't ever put pieces of glass with the clothing, how did these pieces of glass become embedded in his clothing? Well, a reasonable explanation is that he was hit by a car. And that's how these pieces of glass got stuck into him. All right. So, but that was his testimony as well. Now, they eventually went to Karen Reed's parents' house, and they had to go seize the Lexus. They're going to go seize the Lexus, and they're also eventually going to seize Karen Reed's cell phone. Now, they first contacted the Dighton police station so that they can meet them there because they wanted there to be uniformed police officers. They didn't want to just knock on the door and say, yeah, we're from the Massachusetts State Police, just trust us. So they wanted some other uniformed police officers to come with them, and they did do that. So he also showed some different pictures and videos showing that the taillight, the pieces of taillight from Karen Reed's car was missing that morning. Now, he also testified that he never saw Trooper Michael Proctor touch the Lexus vehicle, or obviously have anything to do with breaking the taillight or messing around with the taillight. That was his testimony. He never saw Trooper Michael Proctor do that. Now, eventually he did get to the house and he was interviewing Karen Reed. They were having a discussion, and part of the discussion, they always ask, what was the tone? Did it seem like an interrogation or just a casual conversation? And obviously, if it feels like an interrogation, there can be arguments that the person was scared, the person was nervous, they blurted out things that weren't accurate, or you were scaring them. And here, the testimony was that no, they were having a very nice, casual conversation about what happened. It was a normal tone. Everybody was calm. Somewhat it seemed like the hysteria that Karen Reed was exhibiting at the scene. Already, she calmed down. So it seemed to be a much more of a normal conversation. And this is what she said. So this is very important. This is what Karen Reed is explaining. This is one of the first times that she's giving an interview about what happened, and she's telling Sergeant Yuri Bukhenik what happened, or her recollection of the events that night. And she said that they got into a fight the morning of January 28th, and this seemed to have been what the kids are eating for breakfast, or what you were allowed to feed the kids for breakfast. And this comes back to the Dunkin' Donuts. Right, because Karen Reed apparently gave them Dunkin' Donuts, and John O'Keefe wasn't happy about that. And she's spoiling them, and she's not feeding them right, and whatever. So she said that they got into a little argument that morning about breakfast. And remember, she also said, Jennifer McCabe said that was also part of her discussion with Karen Reed about what to feed the kids and whether she's spoiling them or not. So this was on her mind, and this is what she's telling to Sergeant Yuri Bukhenik. Now, if you're trying to hide the fact that you just committed second-degree murder and you really intended to kill John O'Keefe, I don't think the smartest thing would be to tell the first officer that you're talking to about this case, okay, I shouldn't say the first officer, but when you're having a formal interview, that you were in a fight with the person that morning. Is that really how you hide a crime? But let's just move on. So that's what she said. And she also said that night she was drinking vodka and soda. That was her drink of preference that night. She did go to C.F. McCarthy's. This is what she said. But she claims, this is what she claimed to Officer Bukhenik, that she claimed that she did not leave C.F. McCarthy's with her drink. And remember, we've already heard a number of witnesses testify that she came into the waterfall with what appeared to be a drink that she took with her from C.F. McCarthy's. So she is telling this sergeant that really, or this trooper, that she really did not take anything out of C.F. McCarthy's. She said that she drove to 34 Fairview, dropped off John O'Keefe, and she did not see John go into the house. So she dropped him off, but she didn't see him go into the house. Then she made a 3-point turn. Nothing about texting him, nothing about calling him afterwards. Again, this is what his story is. This is what his testimony is. The officer, Bukhenik. So she made a 3-point turn after dropping him off. Nothing to do with text messages, nothing to do with calling him, where are you coming out, or whatnot. She just did a 3-point turn after dropping him off and left. And then she was asked how the damage to her vehicle occurred. And she said, I don't know. It happened last night. So she didn't know. She was asked if she went into the house. She said, I did not go into the house because she was having stomach issues at the time. Then she said that when she woke up, she began looking for him. And when she found him, she began CPR. And then he started bleeding from the nose and the mouth, and his face was bruised. And then he was asking much more in detail about how she performed this three-point turn to turn around her vehicle after she dropped off John. So when he came back to that, that's when she said she's done talking. She doesn't want to talk about any more about what happened. And then he said that they're going to seize her phone. They're going to seize her car. There's a tow truck that came and picked up her vehicle. And again, there was a video in by her parents' house, and that video picked up the taillight being broken, so they showed that. Now, the tow truck left around 4:15 p.m. from the Reed residence, and it arrived at the Sally Port around 5:30 p.m. And then after that, they had to move it because the Canton Police Department recused themselves from this investigation, so they had to move the SUV out of the Sally Port on February 2nd. And by that time, he said the taillight was already removed. Then they also had footage from John O'Keefe's house prior to January 29th, and that was showing that her taillight was not broken, at least on that day, on January 29th. I'm sorry, that was prior to January 29th. It was not broken before then. And then you had the famous footage, which is we've already seen so many times, from the morning of January 29th, when it looks like Karen Reed's in the middle of the blizzard, 5 o'clock in the morning, when she heard about the news, or when John didn't come home, and she left John O'Keefe's house, and you see her backing up, and the question is whether she actually made contact with John O'Keefe's car. And they showed that video, and as it's moving past the house, he stopped the video, and he said, did you notice any sort of damage to Karen Reed's vehicle? And he said, yes, of course. You see right there that there's damage to her taillight. And then he asked him, do you see any damage to John O'Keefe's car? And the answer, he said, was no. It does not look like John O'Keefe's car was damaged at all. Now, if she backed into John O'Keefe's car and her car got the broken taillight, you would think that there would be some damage to John O'Keefe's car. But again, it's not so conclusive. The video is not the greatest, and it could be that his car is a little bit tougher, and maybe it did suffer maybe some cracks or something, and that could explain it. But he also asked, he said, are there any pieces of glass that you notice in the snow? Now, again, it's possible that the pieces dropped and they fell deep into the snow, so you couldn't find those pieces of glass. You couldn't see them on the ring video. So there are possibilities here that she actually, I'm not going to say that it's a foregone conclusion that because you can't see on the ring video her pieces of her red taillight in the snow there, that means that she did not back into John O'Keefe's car and that she did not break her taillight at that point. There still is potentially a possibility that she hit his car then, some pieces of glass from her taillight broke off, fell into the snow. We couldn't all see it. And by the time she was pulling away, it was already deep into the snow that you couldn't see it. All right. But he did make that point. Now he also went to C.F. McCarthy's to get surveillance. And that's when he started showing the surveillance footage from C.F. McCarthy's. And it was really just to show how many drinks Karen Reed had that night. And you keep seeing how she's drinking from at 8:58, she's taking a drink, her first drink, and then at 9:15 another drink, and 9:20 p.m. another drink. She is drinking a lot, 9:50, 9:33, 9:57, 10:29, and then they have some receipts that he was also showing, and then he also finally showed John O'Keefe with a cocktail glass as he is leaving the waterfall. And that is how the testimony ended, with John O'Keefe leaving the waterfall holding a cocktail glass, which we know was later found at 34 Fairview broken. So that was how the testimony ended today. And we will see if the direct examination wraps up on Thursday, and then we get to see the cross-examination. So that's the recap for day 20 and day 19. Please, if you haven't yet, please subscribe, like, and we will see you next time.